Hey everyone, welcome to a new segment I like to call The State of Comics. For those of you who don't know, wrote comics for many years, still do. Of course, write The Web Comic Factory and Superfrat. But, recently the comic book industry has been going through a lot of changes. And, there's been a lot of woke stuff in comics. Comic sales are down. People are struggling. These comic book stores are really struggling, the brick and mortar guys. And I was in a store today promoting the Pineys, passing out some postcards. So I thought I'd pick up some books and see what was going on because I hadn't looked at a book in years, a paper book. So I got a Marvel, a DC, and an Image book. He didn't have a tremendous amount of indies. Although he did have the guy who does the New Jersey Vampire book, that's a cool book if you haven't seen it. But I think that book and the books I'm about to talk about all have the same problems. See if you can guess before I say it. So, material-wise, I went for books that were recommended by the guys in the store. So the first one was The Immortal Hulk, which was a story. There's a cover there. A story about the Hulk, done as, I think it was very similar to Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. It's written by Al Ewing, in that it's the subtext and the overarching theme is one of the Hulk is just one of many people who are connected to this bigger thing that may or may not be destroying the world. So it was pretty good. I was pleasantly surprised how good this was. I would read this book, except for the reason I'm going to tell you. Next up, Young Justice. Young Justice being written by Brian Bendis. I've always liked Bendis. And it's about the Young Justice tiers being in the multiverse, hopping around the multiverse, trying to get home. And there's sort of an alternate Green Lantern story here. Although she's not really a Green Lantern, it's some sort of hack Green Lantern. The cover's a little misleading. I thought it was going to be a big fight between the evil guys on the cover and the good guys. So I felt that was a little misleading. But beyond that, I thought it was okay. It was felt like part one of 9 million. But other than that, not the best out of the three. But this was okay. Bendis is a good writer. And then this one's called Die. It's from Image, and I picked it up at issue 8, and this may be unfair to the creators, but I just couldn't get into it. This is a story about a group of characters trapped in like a role-playing game, and to me, this was done in a Dungeons & Dragons cartoon. It was done in other comics, and although the artwork seems to be pretty sweet, I can't get into this, and I really hate this cover. This cover, I don't know what you're thinking. And the title, Die. I mean, that's just... Joan's running around on the floor, by the way, because I'm not paying attention to her at this moment. So this comes in a distant third for me. But they all have the same problem. You got a book that was worth reading, a book that was okay, and a book that probably is not for me. What's their problem? Those three comics cost $12. That's the problem. Joan, I know you're very upset about the comic book industry, but please calm down. Here, do you want to come up here, Joan? Joan, you want to come up here for the video? You can come up? All right. Anyhow, the state of comics is pretty much the same. They're too expensive. I don't know how many times I got to say it. And even the guy who does New Jersey Vampires books, and it's a good book, solid. That book's $5 cover price, I believe. And it's just too much. It's just too much. It's too much for several reasons. I'll tell you why. In that same store where I bought these brand new comics, he had old Silver Age books for $3. They have, DC and Marvel are doing reprints of some of their classic stories. So you've got, what would you rather read? Like a classic comic book story, or some news story that's so convoluted and woke you can't even get into it? and the old one's longer because they used to make longer comics, or you could read the new one and be totally lost and have to buy like 19 issues. It's no contest. No contest. So that's one major flaw. The other major flaw is $4 is just too much money. It's just too much money for a comic book, which is essentially 22 pages. 22 pages, you know, and a cover. And one of the guys in the store, he talked about, yeah, he's a big comic book collector. He puts them on his wall. He doesn't read them. He likes the artwork, and he displays them. And he buys and sells like a lot of people. The only guys left in the industry, in the stores, it's seemingly, are guys who don't read. You know, they're guys doing podcasts, you know, like your boy Zach and Ethan Skyver, Van Skyver. And those guys are covering all the woke stuff, and that's fine. But the thing is, one of the reasons all that stuff exists is no one's reading this stuff. I mean, the editorial boards on all the major comic book companies, in my view, don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. They're not publishers. They are brand managers. And when you are a brand manager, that's not good for the actual publication itself, in my view. You need to treat each publication like they're important, not as part of a brand. It seems to me that Marvel's heading down the path of they're just going to absorb the comics into their lifestyle, and it's going to be podcasts and T-shirts and little toys and cartoons and oh yeah, and then sometimes we publish comics. That's not comics. That's not going to get anybody to read anything. If you're going to do that, you might as well just do what Archie did, is pull the plug on all the new stuff and just recycle through it. I think that's where they're headed. I mean, you could take old Neil Adams Batman and just update the technology. You know, you scan it in, you erase all the payphones and answering machines, and you update the dialogue a bit, and you can get rid of the word jive, and you got a whole brand new story. That's what Archie would do for a while, and they were very successful at it because you don't have to pay the artists and writers again necessarily. There might be some royalties involved, but you're definitely not going to have to pay them for the full freight of a whole page, much less 28 pages, which used to be the story length back in the day. In a lot of ways, you're just making money on product you already have. And look, I'm not blaming them for doing that. I'm just as guilty on the Webcomic Factory and Superfrat. I do some of that too. But the thing is, it's a little different for me since I'm a creator, right? I'm a creator. I can take some of those repurposed art pieces and I can make them canon. You know, I can craft a story, and you're getting it from the guy who created the story. The stuff that's coming out now, these guys are just punching a clock. And it doesn't mean they're not talented. It just means there's limits to what they can do. And the editorial people, in my view, since they're more like brand managers, they're not really concerned about story. They're pretty concerned about art. You know, they want some kind of story, but they just want to limit it to a certain area. Because a really good story, a story that would go outside the bounds, you know, they're not interested in that. Unless, and I found this to be absolutely horrifying. There's an issue of Batman, and I nearly bought it, but I really didn't want to support this with my money. It's an issue of The Dark Knight where the Joker apparently uses or threatens to use the Bat utility belt to abort a baby. Now that to me is just beyond. That is just lower than low. It's gross and disgusting and unnecessary. You know, when you're at that point, when you're just doing stuff to ban the comic, to drive up the collectability, or you're just doing stuff to shock people, that's not what I mean about pushing the bounds. Pushing the bounds of the comic book world used to mean what they did in the 70s with say Neil Adams, right? He did this great story about heroin abuse. And one of the main characters, he was a sidekick, Speedy, got addicted to heroin. And this was a big controversial issue. They published it. Fast forward to the Swamp Thing in, I guess it was the 90s. Alan Moore wanted to do a story about the Swamp Thing meeting Jesus. And they yanked him. They yanked it. He quit. And, in my view, the Swamp Thing sort of, although the guys who took over were, Rick Veitch was pretty good for a while. Eventually that just spelled doom for the title and the whole Vertigo line, really. Because once you've sort of crossed that line with your creators, and Alan Moore was not the creator of Swamp Thing, he was the writer, but, once you start doing that to your talent, especially a talent like Alan Moore, who's widely recognized to be a genius, you're basically setting the stage for, okay, we're going to micromanage the stories now. You need talent in the editorial department as well. And I don't think there's been talent in the editorial department of either Marvel, DC, or Image since Jim Shooter left Marvel. I think Shooter was very talented. He was a writer. He understood stories. And look, he cut corners and he did some crazy stuff that didn't quite pay off. But ultimately, he knew how to create epic stuff. And even when he launched his own brand, which didn't last, but there was sort of an epicness to it. The guys who came after, in my view, they're just sort of janitors, kind of sweeping up around the museum as people come in and out, not trying to disturb anybody, not trying to rock the boat. And look, they had a lot of money on the line. They have jobs, they have families. I can't blame them. The risk is gone at the major houses. So I don't know what you're going to get from these comics, but in my view, they're not worth $4. Now you could argue, well, you're not the audience anymore. It's true, but I know what I'm talking about. I've been in the comic industry for years. I know what a good story is. And look, comics are worth about $1 because that's where they all end up. They all end up in the dollar bin, and that's the price. Okay, the really good stuff would go up in price. If you made the comics $1, everybody would buy them again because they'd only be $1. You can come into a comic book store, buy the whole run for like $20, $30 and be on your way, and you could have a huge stack of comics to read. And the problem with that is there's not enough of a price point for store owners, for newsstand people, of course. But the problem with that is this: without the volume, it doesn't matter. Okay? Now you could say, well, the price point, but the thing is, if you were selling 2,000 copies of Superman, you wouldn't care. Okay? If you were selling, if you had legions of customers in a line outside your store, do you really care if you just have to move a lot of physical paper? No. What the comic book industry needs to do is they need to consolidate their digital and print realms. Amazon has done that, right? So if you want a book, you can read it on Amazon for one price. If you want a print book, you got to pay more. That is a model that works for Amazon. It can work for DC or Marvel. I would certainly be more willing to pay a subscription fee for Marvel or DC and read everything, online. If not, then the comic book stores are struggling, and you have to give them something to survive, because they're all going down the tubes. Now, if you don't care about the comic book stores, and I think ultimately a lot of these multinational companies that really run the reins at Marvel and DC, they don't really care about those stores. So why even bother at this point to put on airs and go through previews and stuff? At this point, you might as well just pull the plug on the print and just go full digital, and just do print on demand for anybody who still has to have a print comic. You can even do print on demand for, a big book. And that's what I would do. I would go to a monthly book for like the Batman titles, the Superman titles, all the major titles. Just go to a monthly book and really cut it back, make them cheap, $5 for 4 or 5 issues. And so you could even make it a little more cost effective in those, thick monthly books. You throw in a reprint. You throw in a, here's the Avengers Mansion and how it works and that kind of stuff. If you did that, at first you'd be losing money. So it's a lost leader. You gotta build back the audience. But if you can build it back up, you'll be making more money in the long run. That's what publishing, you have to think about selling comics, selling actual units. If you're not selling actual units, the whole thing's going to go. And it has to be story driven. Absolutely. You got to get out of this variant cover BS. It has to be story driven. Forget the variant covers. If you're going to do a crazy cover that's glow in the dark, do it on all the comics. It's not special. Every comic gets it. You want to put a bullet hole in the Punisher, do it. Put them in all the books. Don't do the special variant cover nonsense. It's killing you. It's sucking up all the money. Money you could spend on better talent, money you could spend on better advertising. Another big thing. The comic book publishers are, in my view, terrible at marketing. They're all terrible. Image was good for a while when they first started. They had skateboards on remote control, the MTV game show. They had, Rob Liefeld being on Levi's commercial. It was all great. It zoomed them to the top. Where's all that now? Where is it? These guys, the guys at Image, man, the clowns run the circus over there, in my view. And I don't mean that as a slam against them. I just mean they need a guy who knows what marketing is. And they have to kind of follow his advice. Now, they're the owners, the creators are the owners. That's great. I love that. But you have to follow some basic marketing principles and get your books to non-comic readers. There's so many different ones at Image, and they just plop them out and they go nowhere. These comic book stores cannot sustain you unless you bring in new customers for them. And you got to lower your cover price. You have to. You have to find a way to publish these books without this high cover price if you want books to sell. So the state of the comic book industry, it's exactly the same as it's always been. Comics are too expensive, they're not being marketed correctly, and they're not really being published. The publishers are a distant memory. So I'd like to see comics bounce back, and Lord knows I'd like to be writing some more in the big leagues, but I don't know if they're long for this world. So get online, my advice, get online and get your $50, $500 Batman download, because you'll be downloading a ton of classic Batman or whatever you're into. And that's the state of comics. Smash like, subscribe. Also, please check out my online books, Wokistan and the Pineys, Pineys 2, coming soon.